I don't even know where to begin. Perhaps I should start with an apology or simply ask you to understand me, regardless of how it looks from the outside. I'm an ordinary woman who one evening found herself in a situation that turned my entire life upside down. When the world around me fell into silence, I was lying in bed, suffering from an unbearable headache. My husband Eric was at work again, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Jimmy, our 25-year-old stepson, was still conquering virtual peaks, and I kept thinking about how it happened that he was still with us. The problem wasn't that I didn't like Jimmy, I did like him, kind and not too troublesome, but I couldn't understand why he kept hanging around our house, as if he didn't want to leave the comfort of his childhood home. Every conversation about his future life ended in an argument with Eric. I wanted to push him out into the real world, and Eric thought that he should stay with us overnight. When I tried to fall asleep in the bedroom, I suddenly began to hear strange sounds. At first, they came from where Jimmy was doing something. I thought it was just the creaking of old furniture, but listening more closely, I noticed that it sounded more like sobbing and moaning. I don't know why, but the more I heard, the stronger the feeling of discontent flared up inside me. Our life was fixated on one thing, and this awkwardness was just becoming its embellishment. I didn't know how long I tried to focus, but soon I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and walked over to Jimmy's door, which was slightly ajar. Inside there was a pleasant semi-darkness. The only source of light was the screen of his laptop. I could hardly breathe. Jimmy was lying on the bed with his eyes closed, completely immersed in what was happening on the screen. I stood in the doorway when a wave of embarrassment washed over me. His hands were twitching in time with what apparently was happening in his virtual world. My heart was pounding wildly in my chest. I squinted to get a better look at him. At that moment, I realized exactly what I had expected. His face was distorted by a strange expression, both confused and something else. And I heard moans that grew louder. I felt the clothes on me tighten with shame. When I began to understand what was happening, as if someone had abruptly torn me from my usual worldview, I felt myself starting to panic and sharply returned to my room, pressing my hands to my face as if trying to contain all the unspoken words in my palms. What was that? Why did I feel that this Jimmy could cause me such a profound shame? I realized that I found myself on the edge of an abyss, but instead of fear, this feeling awakened something new in me, some excited desire. Now I had no choice but to simply come to terms with it. That night, when Eric returned home, I knew that he couldn't even suspect what had happened, but it created an invisible wall between us. We continued exchanging ordinary conversations over dinner, but even repeating the question of how your day went caused tension. We were like two ships passing each other, not understanding that everything could change in an instant. The next day, when I encountered Jimmy again, the air between us seemed to sparkle. I couldn't explain it, but the look that I met, there was something deeper hidden in it. He tried to be indifferent, but his entire posture betrayed him. My gaze met his, and at that moment I felt that each of us was hiding something inexpressible. Seeing how he involuntarily looked away, a wave of tension washed over us, which only intensified with every word he spoke. "Sorry," he said quietly, and I clearly read in his voice a desire to explain himself. Something inside me tightened, as if I was seized by my own strong desire. I felt how each of his words tightened the metaphorical bridge between us, while I remained increasingly agitated. And at that moment, when he finally looked into my eyes, I realized that, perhaps, it was precisely in that look that the understanding lay, in that impulse that connected us. He suddenly began to talk about his awkward moments, and I couldn't help but admire how much this brought us closer. Soon we realized that this evening was a turning point for us in what was obviously a complex game. Right there, in the semi-darkness, we stood on the edge of that boundary we never wanted to cross. I remember how he told me that we were even, and I couldn't help but smirk, realizing it. At that moment, when every word we spoke began to sound like a secret code, everything had long since gone beyond a joke. I realized that this situation would never leave us. We were bound by a completely different reality. That night, all the darkness and tension were washed away by quiet moans and gentle touches woven from sincere feelings. Words no longer mattered. At that moment, responsibility, fears, and rules ceased to exist. We stood side by side, realizing that this new line we had drawn would not be erased. Perhaps it was that connection I had dreamed of for so long, without even knowing that it was exactly that. Everything would change. I lay in bed, staring at the endless ceiling, trying to sort out my thoughts. My heart was still pounding from the wave of emotions I had experienced entering Jimmy's room. My thoughts kept returning to what I had seen, his hands twitching to the rhythm of some invisible stream, his tense, slightly sweaty body. Not in this life, I thought, but these thoughts only intensified my torment. Instead of telling Eric, I deceived myself into believing that maybe it was all normal. Maybe it was just a youthful impulse. Everyone has their own quirks, I repeated like a mantra, but inside I knew it wasn't so. I suffered from these unbearable thoughts, living in a terrible contradiction. How normal is this for a normal person at my age? I decided that tomorrow morning I would explain everything to Jimmy. Actually, I needed to understand how to behave with him, how to finally talk about what had happened. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about Jimmy for a single second. I kept telling myself that there was no reason to be embarrassed, but I was paralyzed by what had happened. Between us and this feeling to which I was not entirely ready. Morning arrived unexpectedly, as always. I got up with a heavy heart and, taking a deep breath, prepared to face the truth. Coming to my senses in the kitchen, I was still in turmoil from the unbearable images and memories that made my temperature rise. And then, when I finished breakfast, my life returned to normal. A familiar sound caught my attention. Jimmy didn't seem to change his habits. I shuddered, realizing what it meant. I left the doors open and tried not to think about it, but my heart began to beat treacherously fast. When the sounds became audible again, it wasn't just noise. It was those moans again. I approached the door of his room and, unable to resist, just opened it to peek inside. And then I was struck again, like lightning. He was lying there exactly as before, in the same pose, with the same sheen on his skin, in his young, fit body. Every muscle seemed to play in the light. For a second, I felt excitement flare up inside me. I quickly closed the door, and tension rose within me. This is unpleasant. This is wrong, I thought. I screamed and went downstairs, trying to occupy myself with something, but all attempts to escape the momentary excitement brought no relief. I tried to focus on cooking, but my actions were mechanical, my thoughts restless, and my heart was still pounding harder than ever. As soon as I turned away, I heard a slight rustling in the hallway. I turned around and saw him. Jimmy had come downstairs, his pants half-zipped, barefoot with an appealing smile. At that same moment, the world around me was enveloped in silence. His innocent smile caused disgusting embarrassment and involuntary excitement, which burned me from the inside, to pierce my mind. I felt something unfamiliar pounding in my chest, robbing me of speech. I stood there like an ice statue, unable to speak. He didn't seem to notice my inner turmoil. His face shone with the joy of morning awakening. Something inside me tightened, and I didn't know how to react to this explosion of emotions. I understood that the situation was strange, and yet my heart tightened as my gaze slid over him. I was tormented because of it. These feelings, they were too many to express in words or to imagine. To choose one side. How can I do this? How can I tell Jimmy that all these emotions washed over me like a wave, and now I stand before him, not realizing that I'm an adult woman, detached and free from emotions, and thinking only about being a mother? "Darling, are you here?" he suddenly asked, and it smoothed over the overwhelming moment. This time I was again stunned. I had to fight the growing excitement in my chest with the simple yet still dangerous spark that awakened something in me that shouldn't be touched. I was still trying to force myself to turn to him, to look into his eyes and understand what had happened between us. But instead, I just swallowed. It seemed I no longer had any arguments against it. I was in complete shock when Jimmy came so close that there was no trace left between us. At that moment, the world around us seemed to freeze, and only our hearts continued to beat like a drumbeat. I pressed my back against the cold metal of the refrigerator, feeling its hardness, and at the same time the heat penetrating the space between us. Jimmy's blue eyes shone, sparkled, like jewels under bright light. There was something playful in them, something attractive, something that made me look at him, as if he was testing me, making me feel like I was sinking into this abyss of temptation and uncertainty. I couldn't understand how we ended up here, in this thrilling moment that was simultaneously confusing and incredibly beautiful. Physical closeness made my heart beat even faster, and my breathing quickened. We were silent, but in our silence, much more was said. This silence was greater than 1,000 words. I felt him approaching, as if everything in the world was losing meaning, except for the two of us. Jimmy leaned in and touched his lips to my neck. Goosebumps ran over my skin, and his touch was like fire between our bodies. I couldn't help it. It was so unexpected, but at the same time gentle and reverent. I felt his breath tickling my skin, and I was pleasantly surprised at how strongly he affected me. "Darling," he said softly. His voice sounded like music, enveloping me in warmth and tenderness. He looked up, and in his eyes there was understanding and desire that needed no words. It was more than just physical attraction. It was a whole universe of emotions that we had suddenly discovered in each other. I felt him run his hand along the back of my head, pulling me towards him. And at the same moment, I realized that this feeling was not a given. I was no longer afraid because I knew that something had arisen between us, filled with passion. We froze in this embrace, and I closed my eyes, allowing this feeling of inspiration to wash over me from head to toe. His lips barely touched my neck, and at that moment, fire ignited within me. My moist eyes reflected feelings that I couldn't express in words, but that made my heart beat faster. What if this is abnormal? I whispered to myself, but that question dissolved in the air as I felt his closeness. He was here with me, and nothing else mattered. I wanted to press against him, to dissolve in this moment and forget about everything that could separate us. I felt Jimmy gently lean even closer, and our lips were just a few millimeters apart, in a matter of seconds. "Don't be afraid of this," he whispered. His eyes burned with longing and reflected a world that wanted to be ours. His words made me shudder. This change of boundaries was expanding our worlds, and I knew that I couldn't back down. And before I could think about anything else, he pulled me even tighter towards him, and our lips met in a gentle but irresistible kiss. It was like a lightning strike, an instantaneous feeling that overwhelmed us both. I felt his warmth, his tenderness, his desire. It was not just a game, it was a real moment. We had both been waiting for the first spark in our interaction, which flared up with a force that burned away all barriers, ordinary norms and doubts. I pressed against him, embraced him, clinging to his warmth, allowing the goosebumps to remain on the bright path of discoveries. "Yes," I murmured aloud, sinking deeper and deeper into him, into his charm, into his courage. It was incredibly simple, complex, exciting, and irreversible.